So, hi everyone. I'm here with Vanessa Northam today. She's the head of charity development at StepChange, one of the leading debt charities in the UK. So, Vanessa, thanks very much for joining me today.
Thanks very much, Chris. Good to see you.
So, I thought first off, I think it'd be just good to get your perspective in terms of obviously we've got a lot in the media around the cost of living crisis, but just really, I suppose, what are you seeing in terms of like volumes that are coming through or changes to volumes that are coming through? Is that sort of like filters through?
Yeah, so I mean, it's an unprecedented cost of living crisis, and I think we're all sort of grappling as to what that is going to mean over the next 2 or 3 years. So, I mean, if I look at sort of existing clients of StepChange, so those are people that are on debt management plans or other solutions. They're very much coming to us, out of sync with sort of annual reviews to say, look, then obviously I'm paraphrasing, but my affordability is challenged because they are needing to review that plan and to see whether that is still affordable or indeed if that's the right solution. So we've seen a significant increase in existing clients coming to us. Some people obviously are in a situation where they can afford a bit more. Maybe they've made savings over COVID, but in the main, it's people sort of coming to us to look at coming off the plan, reducing the payment, or potentially moving to complete re-advice and looking for other solutions. So that's been a big feature of the last 3 to 6 months. When we look at new clients, so people coming to us for the first time, we're definitely seeing quite a different cohort coming through in terms of those that are going on to plans. We're seeing a greater surplus, so that would suggest that people are coming to us with higher salaries and probably didn't think they'd ever need to come for debt advice, because clearly we know from our research that on average people take 12 months before they come to us after the point of crisis. And if you think about sort of coronavirus and where we are now with the cost of living crisis, it's no real surprise that there's people coming with a different set of issues. So in terms of, how that continues in terms of volumes, I think during the pandemic we talked about tsunami, didn't we? And it just hasn't materialised. And I think there's a number of facets to that. I think there was a significant amount of government help, but also we've seen a significant increase in the amount of forbearance and support and solutions from in the main, I would say, the banking sector, particularly the payment holidays, but more broadly than that. So in terms of when do we think, volumes obviously are coming through, and we have seen seasonal outturns. So we, normally by this time of year, as we know, for those in the sector, you'd start to see a sort of reduction, and then you'd see that starting to really, really uptick in the new year. But actually, the volumes that we're seeing in November from creditor referrals are significantly up. So people are obviously taking heed and getting some advice and not waiting until the new year.
So it sounds like in terms of like disposable income, it sounds like it's really that expenditure piece that's gradually creeping up. And so those people who are already in financial difficulties, those already on plans, they're having conversations about how do they renew plans, right? And if that's a difficult conversation, but you'd sort of get in that new sort of like a creeping, because of the creeping increase of cost, you're getting new people who are getting caught in the net. Is that
and it's I've spent a lot of time over the last 3 or 4 weeks out and about and hearing all sorts of predictions or insights from Experian to Credit Strategy to Utility Week and so on. And I think we all know that it is a multiple impact that's causing, as you say, a significant stranglehold on that expenditure costs, with no sight of obviously pay rises or pay rises that are at least going to be able to compete with inflation. And everybody is saying that, the next 18 months, at least 2 years, it is going to be a continual impact on inflation, energy prices, mortgage rates, interest rates, etc. So seeing that expenditure impact is driving people who maybe thought they sort of survived COVID and could weather it, and maybe have turned to credit or other borrowing, but now obviously that surplus is just not meeting the day-to-day needs.
How ready do you think we are as an industry for it? We're used to seeing sort of like shocks coming through, so it's like we can understand it. It's like, oh, something big has happened, and that's what we thought at the start of COVID. It's like, oh, it's a big shock. We're going to put things in place, but this almost like creeping increase is almost like harder to handle, isn't it? Even for consumers, because like when do you say, well, now we're in a crisis versus not, because it's only a little bit different than it was yesterday, which is a little bit different than it was the day before, but over time it really adds up.
Absolutely, and I think we've all tried to look at parallels from 08, haven't we, to say, well, what can we draw from it? And you're absolutely right. Job loss, mass redundancies, bereavement, relationship breakdown or ill health, and causing that inability to earn. But this is not an inability to earn. This is, like you say, it's just a series of ongoing squeezes and squeezes and squeezes. And it's going to be incredibly hard to predict what's going to be the driver of people to suddenly start defaulting or not paying. And I've heard debates over the last sort of 2 or 3 weeks, is it going to be the mortgage? I think it's 30% of people are going to be coming off their fixed rate mortgage in April or Q2. Is it going to be that? Is it going to be car finance? The increase in, the cost of cars, the lack of depreciation because of all the challenges with parts and chips and all of that. So if you look at somebody, 2.4 children, 2 cars, a mortgage, etc., if you start to look at what their current disposable income is, and then you start to add in based on averages, so mortgage, PCP, inflation, energy bills. I mean, I was talking to somebody at a conference the other week. When his mortgage comes to an end, it could be as much as £1,000 a month. Now, that's probably an extreme case, but you're talking an impact on expenditure that's in the high hundreds, if you add it all up. And I think that's where I think I'd be looking in terms of insight and data and the modelling of what is going to be the catalyst that actually starts people down a route where they do need support and help and not turn to additional borrowing, which is going to be increasingly, well, we know that's invariably what people do, but this is a new cohort of people that have probably got well-managed credit at the moment.
But, do you think we're ever going to see it as a wave that comes through? So we were at some of the same events, and we're talking about, is it sort of pressure that's building up, or do you think it's just always just going to keep on leaking and increasing? And if so, where do you think we'll see it first?
I wish I knew. I asked that question. I think the jury's out. I think it will be a continuous sort of wave upon the shore. I think we need to forget this massive wave, because when you talk to major banks and again at the Experian conference, it isn't materialising in significant enough volume for it to start. The anecdotes I've been getting, well, we're seeing bits of it, but maybe it's not going to be a massive spike that we're all used to seeing because of an income shock. It's going to be ripples and ripples and ripples and ripples and ripples. And how do you resource for that? How do you develop forbearance for that? How do you forecast for that? So that's the challenge. And how are consumers going to know when to ask for help? Because if you've been made redundant or you've lost your job, the first thing, I'd be phoning my mortgage provider and going, right, this has happened. But if it's it's a bit like the older sort of cliche, you don't boil a frog by putting it in boiling water. You just keep turning the heat up. That is going to be the real challenge. And I think organisations, need to be thinking about their customer engagement strategies, their marketing, their messaging, and we're starting to see this through television ads, normalising it. I've talked a lot about that over the last 3 or 4 weeks, about normalising support and encouraging dialogue. That is going to be the key, I think, over the next 2 to 3 years.
And obviously, the debt advice sector has pretty close links to a lot of collections departments in a lot of sort of creditors, right? I mean, that's so we talk pretty closely. I mean, but do you think, are you finding that the banks and sort of your clients essentially, and the creditors and utilities, etc., are they doing more upstream than they ever have done before? I mean, is that sort of message going through in terms of almost that pre-collections, pre-arrears kind of support? Because there's a whole marketing exercise you can do there to say, if you need help, even though you don't at the moment, you can reach out here. So when they do, and if they do, and hopefully they don't, then they know where to go.
Yeah, so I think if I was to take those sectors individually, I think the banking sector, most definitely, we're doing early intervention trials to assess even if people are ready for debt advice or indeed need them. And I think yes, absolutely, there's a huge amount, because we all know that everybody's looking for the signs, and the best sign of all is when you can actually engage with that customer. So yes, there is more and more being done way before collections and pre-arrears. I mean, I use this anecdote, but I applied for a credit card a couple of months ago, just to see what messages were on that. That letter that you get, and you can feel the whole plastic, and you're like, oh, brilliant! Here we go and get my balance transfers moving. But there's not a single line on there about anything to do with support or help if anything changes. It was all about spending. And, I might be a frog right now in tepid, 37 degrees water, but I don't know whether that's, and I think that's a real key pivotal point, because I literally had a call with one of the major banks this morning, and they're saying, we're really struggling to get people to engage with us. And it's like, well, at the point that you're struggling, it's really, really hard. We have obviously huge amounts of research and data as well. That's the case. So it has got to be much more further down. I'll say when it comes to utilities, I think that isn't the case. There are more limited levels of support and forbearance, and I think from a utilities perspective, they've always had a very core base of direct debit payers who never materialise into collections, and a fairly sort of foundational base to keep that in. And obviously that is massively changed now. And so the amount of support and forbearance that's available tends to be very much focused on more vulnerable, acutely vulnerable customers, as opposed to people who are struggling. That's a massive challenge. And as I say, I spent time at Utility Week event and hearing about that, but there's no sort of silver bullet there, I don't think, because the early engagement and trying to save energy and do all these things, it's a little late for some people.
Yeah, I mean, the question I was going to ask you, just going back to consumer duty as an example. So this direction of travel that's happening around consumer duty, making sure you're getting good outcomes, which a lot of people have been trying to do anyway, but now it's been regulated in a more robust form, I suppose. But do you think that's part of it? Almost like, how do we have much more sort of end-to-end kind of view around customer relationships, more transparent, sort of honest relationships with customers? I mean, do you think is that the direction of travel that? I mean, even if we do go into a downturn with more financial difficulties, it sort of engenders that kind of approach, doesn't it? Having an honest relationship with your customers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think instead of looking at customers with a real potential at a certain point to go bad, so to speak, is just assume that at some point there's going to be something happens to your customer and they're going to need you, and they're going to need some support financially, and design with that in mind. And we've all got various sort of financial products, and maybe at certain times in our life we've needed support, but it's quite challenging in our sector to understand the lived experience, because most of us understand exactly how collections works, and in my 20s, I got into problems with finances, but it's been a heck of a long time. And indeed, I was speaking to one organisation saying, well, we're not allowed to get into debt. We're not allowed to carry a balance. And it's like, how are you therefore designing journeys to support customers if you're massively limiting that lived experience? And I think there's a report out from Money and Mental Health Institute literally today, about the impact of that collections processes. So, if you could sort of reround the clock and design in for all of that, you're much more likely to get that engagement, and then understand the customer situation and say, actually, we can help, but you've got a lot more going on, and that's what obviously, as the role of debt advice.
And I suppose there's also a bit of reflection that I was pulled up on this in terms of just, do you really understand customer situation and the dynamics of how it because I mean we've all got our own backgrounds, but we've got to really understand that from a customer point of view, haven't we?
Yeah, I mean, my sister-in-law has been really struggling with her energy supplier, and she's saying, they're threatening this, they're taking this out of my bank account, the meter stopped working. So I said, well, have you done this and you've done that? And she's like, I don't even know what you're talking about. I was like, right, bring the bills over here, we'll sort it. So it took us about half an hour to get through. Did the sort of, Vanessa's supporting the account. And, I just went, right, she needs this, she needs that, you need to organise this. She can't do this, she's got this. And she just said, where did you learn to do all of that? And that's the challenge. She didn't know there was help for all the vagaries of things that were going on in her life. And at the end of the call, she had got some breathing space. We'd got her on the priority services register. We'd requested for the meter to be exchanged, all active. There was so much there going on. And this is an articulate, degree educated, woman who just didn't know. And I think we assume, that consumers are well informed, educated, have the capability and the capacity to be able to advocate on their behalf and know what to ask for. And that's the real challenge, isn't it? And it's so, obviously we're talking about telephony first and foremost, but again, trying to do that digitally would have been even more challenging.
Do you see the debt advice sector sort of getting even further upstream in terms of into that much more sort of customer care type scenario, or even the acquisitions and just being much more bigger advocates, as much as we do signposting in collections, but doing that and being much more part of the earlier customer journey as well?
I mean, in an absolute ideal world, yes. And I think the challenge, again, it comes back, what is the purpose of debt advice? And, if you see us as the point of a crisis and all bets are off, then you will resist, obviously, coming to our services before you're in a challenge. And in a previous role, we did some market research and some focus groups, and we had a specific cohort of consumers that we knew were heavily indebted, and they referenced, well, I know about sort of citizens' advice and StepChange, but my situation isn't that bad. And that's a real barrier, because how do we, and I say we as the sector, but also collections, is how are we highlighting what support there is available? Because it's more than just a solution. It's about budgeting. It's about income maximisation. It's about self-employed, calculate. All the things that we've got available to start to unpick actually what help and what could this look like, because it's a big thing turning to advice. And
we all lead increasingly complicated financial lives, even in terms of might have different credit cards, you might have different online accounts versus the account you opened when you were a child, or and you have different lending products. It's quite complicated, even in terms of mobile phones and sort of motor finance. And it adds up, doesn't it? And you've got and just the brain power to sort of the attention, I suppose, span to sort of manage all these things when you've already got busy life is difficult.
And also that you and I and other people watching this call will know what support is available, what the triggers are, So I if you as a consumer who are struggling, and the first call that you make is to the council tax, and you've missed 2 payments already, that conversation is going to look quite different to a first call to a financial service provider where you're saying you're going to struggle to make your first minimum payment. Now, you and I would know, well, that's because, you need to engage with council tax, you know, and there'll be other people who are saying, well, I'm not going to pay my energy bill because you know, they can't disconnect me. But we would know and say, but that then starts to impact your credit rating, and you could end up, you know, with a force fit prepayment meter. And it's different, you know, let alone different policies within different organisations, the myriad of sectors. So, you know, that's a massive challenge for consumers to navigate, and to know what to ask for, and know what their rights are, and know what they're allowed to ask for.
It's a bit of a minefield, I suppose. That's why you can get specialist help, right? So which is what you guys do. But
that's it, and you know, what we're able to do is see the whole of the iceberg, and I use this analogy quite often. You know, we saw this in the early stages of breathing space. You know, organisations going, you know, these people you're putting on breathing space are in our good books. You know, why? And we got a significant amount of challenge, and then through those accounts being reviewed and eyeballed and analysed, actually there was some early warning signals, and they weren't being acted on. And that's another challenge. Is, you know, we've got all this data, we can look at, but what is the action? You know, what is the messaging? Because there's I would imagine a fear of sort of complaints and saying, how dare you think that, you know, I'm struggling. I mean, I think, you know, persistent debt in you know, pre-pandemic, you know, a lot of consumers were hugely disgruntled with, you know, being told that, you know, that they were going to potentially lose the access to the cars, and yet they've been paying all the time. And it comes down to really, you know, effective engagement and communication, and learning the lessons, I think, from that persistent debt activity.
And I suppose some of it comes back to what is the relationship we have with our financial products as well, and how do we have that sort of transparent relationship, which is the consumer duty piece, I think, that's coming through as well.
Well, yeah, and I don't know about anybody watching, but I've been surprised at how little messaging I've had from my myriad of financial service providers, and I do have a lot of products because I'm interested in seeing how they all work.
Yeah.
But I think I've had. It's only one. It's my main bank that my salary goes into, and it's only them. I've not seen anything, whether it's email, text, nothing targeted. And it doesn't need to be targeted. It doesn't need to say, Vanessa, you know, we think you're doing X, Y, and Z. But it could just be look, we know there's a cost of living crisis. If you need our help, I've been really surprised at how little there has been.
Yeah, is that getting out with that early marketing? I mean, more generally, how do you find that creditors reacting to the situation? I'm particularly maybe just chat a little bit around things like technology, and there's been a lot of work to sort of like, you know, trying to link things together to make it more seamless for the consumer. How do you sort of see that kind of developing, and what sort of things are in the works from a creditor point of view?
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say there's been a significant shift and a focus to online. From a collections perspective, I mean, if you go back 3 or 4 years when I was in a previous role, we did a huge amount of research to say, okay, who has got an online collections journey where I can do my I&E, that I can do my payment plan and keep it up to date. And I think we found 1 or 2, and everybody said, you need to call us. I haven't done the research since to see what that now looks like, but we know that there's been a significant investment to do that, and quite rightly so. In terms of sort of the future of how, you know, the expectations of consumers in a world where you've got an Amazon, and then you come into the world of collections, and particularly with likely the new cohort of consumers who have never found themselves in this situation and no idea what happens on a collections call, what will their expectations be, and how difficult and how frictionful and how much customer effort is there going to be when they're used to doing things, you know, and how do we make sure that it doesn't feel punitive because you suddenly find yourself in this situation. So I think seamless integration, sharing data, sharing support needs, getting people at the right stage in the journey into debt advice. I mean, those are all things that I'm really, really focused on. So, you know, we've been looking at sort of digital signposting and how ineffective that is, and how do we need to solve for that. So we've been working with New Day to sort of say, okay, so if you're going to signpost to us and you don't have the conversation with an advisor that explains why you need it, how are we going to improve that experience? So we've done that, and that's now been launched. It's called StepChange Direct. It's a money health check as opposed to you need to go to debt advice. Here's this cold landing page, and we're seeing the conversion go up sevenfold, and that's now been rolled out to a number of tier one banks, and will really help actually as we go into increased periods of demand to obviously telephony online work interchangeably because it's omni-channel, but there are going to be times when it's going to take a while to get through to us, and that's why starting online is really, really important.
It does feel like there's maturity that's coming up around sort of digital processing. It's almost like but way back it was always like we're going to be digital, we're just going to automate our process, it's going to be digital, or it's always going to be sort of like on the telephone. But there's like there's maturities coming up around like, well, how do you tweak it to make it almost like everything integrated? And so at some points you might need to talk with someone, but at some points maybe you don't, and you don't want to as well. And it's like, how do you sort of build that maturity up? It feels like that's what we're evolving to.
Yes, and I'm definitely seeing some examples of that. I mean, if I look at something like a utility, I'm a big fan of Octopus Energy, and the way that they're interacting with me at the moment, I'm lucky to have a smart meter and I'm lucky to be a fairly informed consumer, but I'm having opportunities to sort of cut my consumption over a set period of time to gain money off my bill. And it's just beyond easy. It's one click and I'm in. And, so that seamless integration, it's about reducing that customer effort. And if you look at your collections journey and think, how effortless is it versus effortful? It's pretty tiresome. And if you're doing that, on average, people have around 9 debts that we see. You're doing that 9 times, 9 different ways. And I think in the designing of the journey, it's not forcing your customer because you want them to do a certain thing. It's about having, sometimes we just want to speak to somebody, and sometimes I just do want to do it all online. And it's how the journey's designed in that way. So it's not saying, well, you get to this stage, then you need to phone us, or you can only do that on the telephone, or you can only do that online, and then we'll call you. It's
a bit more nuanced. So obviously there's been big changes in terms of the debt advice sector with funding announcements that have come out, and I know that sort of, I've seen press releases from you guys really around that. And I suppose it's just good to get your opinion, I suppose, in terms of like where you think it sort of evolves from here, because it's quite a big change in terms of like at least some of the funding and how that kind of works, and how that sort of, you think that's going to kind of change the sector really.
Yeah, it's been an interesting couple of months. So, I mean, the Money and Pension Service commissioning outcome results in around about a 15% income drop for charity. And when your role is to be accountable for funding, that's an incredibly big gap. So, in a roundabout way, it kind of resurfaces a conversation and a challenge that I think we've all been sort of kicking about what is the right way to fund a service. And, everybody will know, probably watching the call, that obviously we receive fair share. And then there's been times when we've obviously had to ask for additional funding. And I think the time is now right, and I know that this conversation is going to start in earnest in the new year to look at, for those organisations that are non-funded, so ourselves, Payplan, non-MAPS funded rather, what there is huge value. That's one thing that we've definitely heard over the last couple of months, that we provide a valuable service. And right now, creditors are worried about that. So I think we will come together and work with predominantly the financial services sector, because they tend to be the mainstay of funding. We've been working incredibly hard this year to elicit a greater degree of funding from the utility sector, because the number of utility companies referring to us and the volume is significant, and that sector isn't obligated to pay, but we have sort of brought about the largest amount of funding we ever have from that sector. But that conversation needs to be ongoing. So I don't see it just being a sort of financial services and UK finance conversation. We're talking to Ofgem, we're talking to Energy UK, and some of those organisations have really stepped up, and others have really not. So,
and that's especially with the cost, with energy costs going up, right? I mean, that sort of becomes, and everything's kind of linked in. It's not like they're different consumers. They are all the same customer, and and it's one thing that will just end up triggering something else as it comes through. So it's sort of like you have to look at it in the whole.
We did some analysis to look at, and it's really challenging to try and sort of cost for energy customers, because invariably their ongoing consumption is still the main issue, whereas you can crystallize a credit card and put that into the debt management plan. That doesn't work as well for utilities, and that's an age-old problem as we know. But we looked, and we're protecting at the moment. So if you think about when people come to debt advice, you go through an income and expenditure and you do priorities first, and utilities is a priority. We're protecting in those income and expenditure, just for utility referrals, about £80 million of monthly expenditure, across a year. And if I was to tell you, that we've received, significantly less than that in terms of funding, so that we do need to solve for that, and that's something that, with my background in energy, I'm very keen to address.
So it sounds like it's going to force a bit of a review around sort of like how everything sort of fits together. I mean, it's been a very sort of like, it's sort of evolved over time, it feels to me, and it's sort of and it's sort of worked, but now this is sort of upsetting the process to a certain extent, and now it's like we just need to just understand how everything kind of fits together, and it's going to sort of force that discussion to a certain extent.
And I think to your original point, debt advice and collections have tended to be at a big life event and a big income shock, and we are in a world that will still happen. There's likely to be job losses. There's a whole heap of pain to come, no doubt. But what is the service in that boiling the frog, and what's the sort of evolution of the service, and what's the role that we can play, and what's the funding for that? And we believe in a society, our vision and our mission is a society free from problem debt, and who knows, it might be that actually earlier interventions and education, and I don't mean financial education from a sort of an academic perspective, but what are those telltale signs that we all know about, but consumers are probably going, it'll be fine.
Well, Vanessa, thanks very much for making the time to chat. I mean, it's fascinating as always, and we always cover lots of different topics whenever we chat, and sort of gets into all sorts of interesting things. So, I mean, we'll see how the next 6 months kind of pan out. I mean, it's concerning for everyone, really. I think. I mean, that's for sure.
And it's uncharted territory for everyone right now. And I think keeping talking and keeping the conversation and sharing insights is absolutely critical.